In this dramatized account, the final royal engagement isn't just a goodbye, it's a trigger. Because as cameras flash and smiles hold, a palace staffer claims they heard Meghan say something about Camilla that didn't sound petty, it sounded final. One sentence, spoken softly, that changed the temperature of the room. And inside the palace, temperature shifts matter more than headlines. Because when the air changes, it means power has moved. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Because the last engagement in this dramatized story isn't a public moment, it's a pressure cooker. The palace may call it routine, but everyone inside knows final moments are the most dangerous. Final moments are where people slip, where masks crack, where someone says one honest thing because they believe there will be no consequences, only to discover consequences were waiting all along. The smiles are held too tightly. The choreography is too precise. The atmosphere is polite, but not warm. And underneath it all sits the unspoken truth. This isn't just an appearance, it's an exit. That's why the staffer matters. In royal life, staff are trained to disappear, move silently, speak little, observe everything, and then forget it on command. But in this dramatized account, the staffer can't forget what they heard because it didn't sound like gossip. It didn't sound like a snide comment made for drama. It sounded like a conclusion, like someone closing a file. And when a sentence feels like a conclusion, it becomes dangerous because it implies knowledge that was gathered, processed, and weaponized. The quote is teased as not insulting strategic, and that detail is what makes it sting. Strategic means it wasn't said for emotional release. It was said with purpose, measured, quiet, controlled. The kind of statement that doesn't demand attention but creates an echo. In this dramatized story, that is why the temperature shifts, because the palace can handle anger. Anger is messy and easy to dismiss. Strategy is colder. Strategy suggests intent. Strategy suggests a plan. And if Meghan spoke with strategy about Camilla in her final engagement, it means she wasn't just reacting, she was signaling. The reaction around her is immediate and revealing. Forced smiles appear like armor. People reposition themselves as if they're trying to break sight lines, break proximity, break whatever invisible chain that sentence just created. A quiet interruption arrives too quickly, the way it does when someone is trying to stop a moment from becoming memory. Someone changes the subject with unnatural speed. Someone laughs at the wrong time. And in the palace, those tiny reactions are louder than words, because they reveal fear not of rudeness, but of meaning. Then comes the hint that makes the entire story feel older than one engagement. The remark, the staffer suggests, connects to something deeper, something that predates the public drama, something that lives in private corridors and private files, the kind of something the palace believes it owns. This is where the tension sharpens into mystery, because if a final sentence about Camilla lands like a trigger, it implies there was already a wire beneath the floor, something sensitive enough that a few words could activate panic. And that's when the cliffhanger hits like a knife wrapped in velvet. The staffer claims an aide whispered, "She shouldn't know that." Not "she shouldn't say that." Not "that was inappropriate." No. The word "no" changes everything, because it suggests Meghan's sentence wasn't simply opinion. It was information. It was recognition. It was confirmation of something the palace believed was hidden behind protocol and sealed behind loyalty. In this dramatized account, that whisper spreads faster than any public leak because it carries the kind of fear the palace understands best, the fear of exposure. The fear that someone leaving the institution might take knowledge with them that cannot be controlled once it's outside the gates. The fear that the wrong truth could become the wrong narrative at the wrong time. And when the palace fears narrative, it doesn't react like a family. It reacts like a state. The staffer's mind races through what the palace could mean. Did Meghan notice a pattern in who had access and who didn't? Did she hear something in a private conversation that wasn't meant for her? Did she see an internal list, a schedule, a decision trail that connected Camilla to influence the palace would rather keep invisible? Or did she simply say something so precisely aligned with an internal truth that it terrified the people who thought the truth was locked away forever? Because locked away is the palace's favorite illusion. It believes it can lock away documents, lock away conversations, lock away history, but it forgets one thing: people leave, staff leave, witnesses leave, and sometimes the most dangerous thing to the palace isn't a scandal. It's a person who quietly understands the system and walks out anyway. In this dramatized story, the final engagement becomes the moment the palace realizes it may not have controlled the information as tightly as it believed. The goodbye becomes a crack in the wall, a soft sentence becomes a lever, and the staffer, trained to disappear, suddenly becomes the carrier of a truth the palace never wanted to travel. And if Meghan shouldn't know, the next question becomes unavoidable: what information was she exposed to that the palace believed was locked away? Camilla isn't just a person in this dramatized story. She's a symbol. The symbol of who is allowed to rise, who is forgiven, and who must adapt to survive. That's why any comment about her lands differently. It doesn't stay personal, it becomes political. And when a staffer says Meghan's words hit the consort question, it signals something brutal. This isn't a feud. It's a war over whose influence the monarchy will tolerate. Because consort influence isn't a crown you can photograph. It's soft power, access, scheduling, staffing, optics. It's who gets a meeting and who gets delayed, who is allowed to bring someone into a private space and who is politely blocked, who can shape a diary without appearing to, who can place a trusted advisor close to the king and call it support. In this dramatized account, that's why Camilla is the fault line. A consort isn't just a partner. A consort can become a system of influence, and the palace watches that system like it's a fire, useful when contained, terrifying when it spreads. The palace's deepest fear isn't scandal, it's capture. The perception that consort power looks like capture, if mismanaged capture of the king's schedule, capture of access lanes, capture of what gets seen and what stays hidden. And once that perception exists, it becomes a threat to legitimacy. People stop asking, what does the crown want? And start asking, who is steering the crown? In royal life, that question is radioactive. It undermines authority. It makes every decision look suspicious, every appointment look like favoritism, every silence look like strategy. That's where the tension triangle hardens in this dramatized story: Charles, Camilla, and the Wales household's long-term strategy. Charles is the center, king, symbol, target. Camilla is the present partner, support and influence bundled together, and the Wales household is the future patient, controlled, obsessed with stability, because stability is what will eventually become their inheritance. When those three forces pull in different directions, the palace doesn't feel like a family. It feels like competing governments sharing the same building. Public unity becomes performance. Private competition becomes routine. Smiles get practiced. Handshakes become choreography. The palace can look seamless, while the internal atmosphere feels like a Cold War. And in this dramatized account, Meghan's alleged remark lands like a match because it isn't framed as drama. It's framed as recognition. It touches something insiders already fear, but never say openly: that influence isn't evenly distributed, and some people are closer to power than the public realizes. That's why the staffer says Meghan's words hit the consort question. Not did she like Camilla, but what does Camilla represent? Who is allowed to rise? Who is forgiven? Who is told to adapt? Because Camilla's journey in palace mythology is loaded. It's about acceptance after controversy. It's about proving loyalty after doubt. It's about being folded into an institution that does not forgive easily. So any comment about Camilla becomes a comment about the palace's rulebook: how it rewards, how it punishes, how it reshapes history to survive. Then the story sharpens into a more specific threat. The staffer hints Meghan's words referenced proximity and permission. Those two words are the palace's hidden language. Proximity determines influence. Permission determines legitimacy. You can't publicly announce permission, but you can feel it in who is allowed to be near the king when decisions are made. who stands closest at key moments, who is invited into private space, where trust is formed. In this dramatized account, if Meghan referenced proximity and permission, she wasn't making a petty observation, she was pointing at the palace's control mechanism. And that is where the lists begin to matter. The palace doesn't call them lists, but it treats people like categories: safe, risky, useful, inconvenient. Who can be trusted near the future? Who must be kept at a distance? Who is allowed to speak freely and who is quietly managed? In this dramatized story, the staffer's implication is chilling. Meghan's remark sounded like someone who had seen how the palace sorts people, like someone who had learned the difference between being welcomed and being tolerated. The emotional beat underneath all of this is that public unity is the palace's shield and private competition is its reality. Everyone is smiling because the institution demands it, but inside, everyone is measuring. The Wales household measures the future, Camilla's circle measures survival, courtiers measures risk, and a staffer trained to observe without being observed senses the truth. When permission and proximity become the theme, the palace is no longer managing relationships, it's managing control. That's why the moment feels bigger than a comment. It feels like a signal that someone has recognized the machine. And once the machine is recognized, it becomes dangerous, because you can't unknow what you've seen. And once permission becomes the theme, the story turns darker, because permission is how the palace controls belonging. Royal staff learn one sacred rule: never repeat what you hear. In this dramatized account, the staffer who speaks up doesn't do it for attention. They do it because the line Meghan said keeps echoing, because it explains too much. And the moment staff break silence, the palace doesn't argue, it tightens. Because if staff can talk, then the palace can bleed. Because staff aren't just employees in royal life, they're the memory of the institution. They carry what the palace says in private and what it pretends never happened. That's why they're trained in discretion so deeply. It becomes instinct: eyes forward, voice low, loyalty first. In this dramatized story, breaking code signals something serious, not drama, but danger. If a staffer risks their position to speak, it means the sentence they heard isn't just gossip. It's a key that suddenly makes other strange moments make sense. The palace responds the way it always responds when a key appears in the wrong hands, with deniability. No paper trail, only compliance. No direct accusation, only pressure. It doesn't call meetings about the sentence. It calls meetings about protocol. It doesn't tell staff to stop talking because they heard something damaging. It reminds them of privacy obligations and duty. The palace doesn't want a fight it can lose, so it creates a world where the fight can't officially exist. And inside that deniability, internal factions move like separate animals sharing one cage. Security wants control. Courtiers want stability. Household aides want their side protected. None of them are fully aligned, because each serves a different survival instinct. In this dramatized account, that's what makes the aftermath feel paranoid. People aren't sure who is listening, who is reporting, who is quietly building a case. A staffer's fear doesn't come from the press. It comes from the palace itself, because the palace is where consequences are designed. The emotional beat turns sharp when staff realize what always happens after a sensitive moment: someone will be scapegoated. Not publicly, but professionally. A reassignment that looks routine. A sudden performance review. A quiet removal from access lanes. That's how the palace discipline. Without admitting discipline. And the staffer who speaks up knows it. They can feel the institution narrowing around them, not with rage but with procedure. Then comes the most chilling hint. The staffer implies they were warned not to mention Camilla, not threatened like in a movie, warned like in a palace. A subtle reminder, delivered with a smile. A sentence that sounds like advice but carries the weight of authority. Don't repeat it. Don't discuss it. Don't let the wrong people hear your memory. In this dramatized story, that warning is what confirms the line wasn't ordinary. Ordinary moments don't trigger warnings. Ordinary moments don't need protection. And then the memo arrives. Clean language. Cold intent. Do not discuss the engagement. Not be careful. Not respect privacy. Do not discuss the memo doesn't just manage staff. It manages narrative. It seals the story before it can become a story. And when memos appear after a single sentence, it means the palace isn't protecting privacy, it's protecting power. Because once the palace tightens, the sentence becomes more dangerous, not less. Silence doesn't erase a line. Silence gives it gravity. It turns it into a forbidden object, something people remember precisely because they were told not to. And in this dramatized account, the staffer's mind starts racing through what that sentence could have been, not in exact words, but in meaning. Because meaning is what the palace fears, meaning is what spreads. In this dramatized story, the comment isn't explosive because it's cruel. It's explosive because it has two meanings. One sounds harmless, the other sounds like an accusation the palace can't survive. That's why people freeze, because nobody knows which version will travel. And inside royal walls, the version that travels becomes the version that wins. The staffer describes the impact without presenting a verbatim fact, because impact is the truth the palace can't edit. The room tightened, smiles clipped. People repositioned. A conversation ended too quickly. Those reactions are what revealed that the words carried double weight. One interpretation, innocent observation, could be dismissed as misunderstanding. The other, revealing allegation, would force a response the palace doesn't want to give. And that's the palace's fear. Interpretation becomes evidence in public. A harmless-sounding version can mutate into something sharper once it reaches people who already suspect the institution of manipulation. In this dramatized account, the palace understands that it doesn't need the exact quote to be damaging. It only needs the public to believe the quote implied something true. Because implication is how reputations die slowly, plausibly, with enough doubt that denial looks desperate, the emotional beat becomes morally loaded because Meghan is framed as either brave or reckless, and both frames polarize. Brave suggests she spoke truth. Reckless suggests she destabilized unity. Either way, someone benefits from the chaos and someone gets painted as the problem. And the staffer, watching this unfold, realizes the palace will pick the interpretation that protects itself even if it sacrifices people in the process. Then the cliffhanger lands in a single sentence, spoken by someone who knows how the palace draws its lines. That's not for her to say out loud, not because it's rude, because it's dangerous. Because once something is said out loud, it can't be contained by courtesy. It becomes a record in memory, and memory is the one archive the palace can't fully control. That's when legal language begins to hover at the edges: defamation, protocol, security risk, not because the palace loves law, but because law is how it turns emotion into procedure. Procedure gives it cover. Procedure gives it authority. Procedure lets it punish without admitting it is punishing. And once legal language enters, the conflict stops being emotional, it becomes procedural. The monarchy doesn't fight in public. It fights through narratives. In this dramatized account, the palace responds, not by denying the comment, but by burying it under a stronger story: briefings, selective leaks, and carefully placed concerns, meant to make Meghan's credibility the headline instead of the words themselves. Because if they can't erase what was said, they can erase who said it. Because this is how palace warfare stays invisible: soft war tactics that never look like war, a leak here, a briefing there, a strategic silence that allows the worst interpretation to grow while the palace keeps its hands clean. Scapegoats offered quietly so the institution can claim it had nothing to do with it. In this dramatized story, the machine doesn't rush to prove innocence. It rushes to control damage. And the fastest way to control damage is to move attention away from the words and onto the speaker's stability. So the narrative shifts cleanly, efficiently toward Meghan as unstable, emotional, attention-seeking, not through one dramatic accusation, but through a drip of concern. Concern is the palace's most effective disguise. It sounds caring while it destroys credibility. It makes skepticism look responsible. It makes doubt look protective. And once doubt is planted, it becomes easier for the palace to say, without saying it directly: don't listen to her. Don't trust her. Don't repeat what she said. Focus on how she behaved, not what she revealed. The pressure points activate like switches. Staff loyalty becomes a battleground. Media relationships become a shield and a sword. Protocol committees become the palace's quiet courtrooms, where decisions can be framed as standards rather than punishment. Every lever the institution can pull without leaving fingerprints gets pulled. A diary entry disappears. A meeting gets delayed. A friendly reporter receives a convenient context. A critical voice is described as unhelpful. In this dramatized account, the palace doesn't crush people loudly. It isolates them until they stop being believed. And the emotional beat is the cruelest part, isolation as punishment, without stating punishment. People stop returning calls. Invitations vanish. Neutral faces turn cautious. Staff become polite, but distant. The room gets colder, not because anyone is angry, but because everyone has been taught what happens to people who disrupt the story. The palace doesn't have to threaten. It only has to demonstrate consequences. Once, and the rest of the building learns the lesson. That's when a senior aide names it with clinical calm, Phase 1 containment. Not emotional containment. Narrative containment. The idea that the first step is not to prove anything, but to reduce the blast radius. And inside Phase 1, a hidden beneficiary emerges, someone who profits from chaos, someone who gains leverage by offering solutions to a crisis they may have helped amplify, someone who looks steady while others are framed as unstable. Because in palace politics, stability is currency, and crises are opportunities to collect it. And if this is Phase 1 containment, the next step is inevitable: control the witnesses. In this dramatized story, the most dangerous people aren't royals, they're staff. Because staff carry memory and memory can't be spun once it speaks. That's why, after the engagement, schedules shift, access narrows, and familiar faces disappear. Not dramatically, quietly. Like pieces being moved off a board before anyone realizes the game has started. Reassignments are framed as routine, but the timing feels too perfect. A staff member is suddenly moved to a different rota. Another is given time off. A third is quietly removed from proximity to key figures. The palace calls it normal housekeeping. But in this dramatized account, it looks like witness management. Because if fewer people share the same hallway, fewer people can share the same memory. And once memories are separated, the palace can reshape them. Staff are pressured to remember correctly, not with threats, but with guidance. With subtle questions that suggest the desired answer. With reminders of policy. With a calm tone that implies there is a right version of events and a wrong one, and your career depends on choosing wisely. Security becomes narrative security, not physical security. It's about controlling who speaks, who overhears, who repeats, who records. And the staff feel it as a tightening around their personal lives. Phones watched, conversations discouraged, friendships suddenly inappropriate. The emotional beat is heavy guilt, fear, loyalty tests. Some staff feel loyal to the crown and believe silence protects stability. Others feel loyal to truth and believe silence protects wrongdoing. And in this dramatized story, the palace forces them into that moral corner on purpose. Because a divided staff is easier to manage than a united one. Divide the witnesses, and the story becomes fog. Fog is the palace's favorite environment. Then the cliffhanger lands. One witness refuses to sign a statement. That refusal doesn't have to be public to be explosive. It signals resistance inside the machine. It suggests someone won't be quietly folded into the official version. And once that happens, panic returns, not theatrical panic, but operational panic. Because the palace can neutralize a rumor, it struggles to neutralize a witness who won't cooperate. And then the final threat appears like a shadow behind the curtain. A second staffer is ready to speak, not because they want fame, but because the reshuffling, the pressure, the remember correctly guidance has made them feel hunted. And hunted people sometimes choose to burn the map rather than keep running. And when a second witness appears, the palace realizes too late, this isn't a rumor anymore. It's a pattern. Every royal war ends in paperwork. In this dramatized story, the comment triggers an internal paper trail: incident notes, access logs, meeting summaries, and guidance documents meant to seal the narrative. Because once the palace writes, it doesn't just record, it redesigns reality. And the more it writes, the more it reveals what it's truly afraid of. Because paper is the palace's favorite weapon. A rumor can be dismissed. A feeling can be mocked. But a document turns chaos into structure. It creates an official version that people are expected to obey, even if they don't believe it. In this dramatized account, the comment doesn't die after the engagement. It mutates into procedure. Suddenly there are memos, privacy protocol, staff conduct, communications guidance. The language is clean, but the intent is sharp. Stop the story from spreading by turning it into a controlled file. And that's where the two possibilities emerge, both terrifying for different reasons. One possibility is legitimate caution, an institution trying to prevent staff from leaking, trying to protect privacy, trying to keep a volatile situation from becoming public spectacle. But the other possibility is darker, weaponized cover-up, documents designed not to protect privacy, but to bury truth, not to calm the building, but to control it. Because in palace warfare, caution can be real and still be used as camouflage. Paranoia spikes the moment paperwork starts circulating. Who wrote the first memo? Who requested the internal review? Who added language that didn't need to be there? Who altered a line after it was drafted? Because the palace doesn't write with one hand, it writes through committees, officers, assistants, and advisors who all carry their own loyalties. In this dramatized story, that's why paper becomes dangerous, because the paper trail reveals fractions. A single phrase can expose who is protecting whom. Then comes the emotional twist. Someone close to Camilla may be exposed, not by the public, but by the record. An internal meeting summary that places a name in the wrong room at the wrong time. An access log that confirms a conversation happened even after someone claimed it didn't. A guidance document that is too specific, as if it's designed to prepare defenses before questions are even asked. That's the dread of the palace writing too much. The more it tries to control the narrative, the more it shows its hand. And then the warning message circulates like a poison note passed beneath a door: do not let this reach the public. That sentence isn't about discretion. It's about fear. Fear that if the wrong document escapes the building, the palace loses its greatest advantage, the ability to redesign reality privately. Because once paper becomes public, it stops being guidance. It becomes evidence. In this dramatized story, that's when the sealed clause is referenced: an instruction, a guideline, a standing rule that nobody wants to discuss out loud. Sealed clauses are the palace's ghosts. They imply decisions made long ago, boundaries drawn in private, protections built into the system, so that when crises erupt, the institution can justify harsh actions as policy. A sealed clause means this was anticipated. It means the palace has practiced for a moment like this before. And when the palace tries to bury a document, the final truth becomes unavoidable. Someone is more afraid of what's written than what's whispered. In this dramatized story, the final engagement doesn't close a chapter. It opens a war. Because once Meghan's words exist in staff memory, the palace must choose admit the fracture or seal it behind protocol. And the palace always chooses protocol. New rules appear. Smiles tighten. Access changes. And insiders whisper, the most chilling part: this wasn't the end. It was phase 1. The institutional aftermath arrives quietly, like frost spreading over a window. Tighter controls. Fewer casual moments. Less spontaneity. The palace doesn't want another unpredictable sentence, another memory that can't be controlled. So it reduces opportunities for truth to happen naturally. It turns interactions into managed events. It places people into lanes. It narrows invitations. It builds a structure where accidents become harder, and that structure deepens the family fracture. Polite unity continues, because it must. But behind closed doors, trust becomes strategic. Every household begins guarding its own interests. Conversations become careful. People stop speaking freely in the wrong rooms. The palace feels more like a controlled institution and less like a family, because family is messy and the palace can't afford mess. A surprise beneficiary gains influence amid the chaos, someone who thrives when the building is anxious. Someone who looks steady, offers solutions, and collects power by being the calm voice in a storm. And the consort question escalates in the shadows: who belongs near the future? Who is allowed proximity to the next generation, the next reign, the next narrative? Because the real war in royal life is always about access to people, to moments, to meaning. Then the final twist lands like a door, locking another private moment is now under review. Not just this comment, not just this engagement, a pattern, a series, a history being re-evaluated by people who never forget and rarely forgive. And the end cliffhanger tightens the dread. Phase 2 targets roles, invitations, proximity. Who stands where? Who is seen with whom? Who gets called? Who gets quietly removed from the frame? And as the palace doors close again, one reality settles in like a storm cloud. This wasn't a comment, it was the opening shot of the next royal war. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.